Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the archaeologist, now let's get into the travels. Today's episode is a fun one. Today's is Petra. Now one thing to note before we start is I went to Petra probably around 10 years ago, so keep that in mind as we look through the photos. And I have a lot of photos, but I don't have a lot of footage because this was before I knew I'd be starting a YouTube channel. Yep, Petra came before this channel, before COVID, even before I immigrated to England. Yet, Petra remains hands down my most memorable experience. It's hard to say what my favorite place to visit was, but whenever the question comes up, Jordan is always in the shortlist. Prior to Jordan, my view of the desert was limited. I thought the desert itself was limited, and Jordan really did prove me wrong. Never before did I realize just how beautiful a desert could be. If your next trip is in Jordan, you're in for a real treat, and if it's not, make sure to put it on your list. The Wadi Rum in particular is especially worth a visit, and there's even hidden archaeological treasures there too. Take for example these petroglyphs which were made by Natufians. Natufians are widely considered the first agriculturalists, and you can see that they represented this in their art. Look at these domestic animals for example. And in the middle of this desert, which has been inhabited for about 100 millennia, lies the city of Petra, the great capital of the Nabataean people. The road to Petra starts out slow. It lies between narrow canyons until, suddenly, you catch a glimpse of it. Boom! Yeah, just kidding. This is what it actually looks like. It opens out onto the most iconic building in Petra, the Treasury, and it is a stunning view. It's a true feat of architecture carved from the rock itself, taking very skilled hands a lot of time to craft it. Now this treasury, which wasn't actually a treasury by the way, but we'll get into what it actually was later in the video, this sudden awe you experience in seeing it, coming down the canyon and into this opening, that is very much on purpose. This was built to impress you, and it does that job spectacularly well. But despite its name, it is not a treasury. It is just a facade, but this didn't stop people from trying to break treasure out of it, as these 19th century bullet holes in the top show. They tried to shoot it open and release the gold. And yeah, I know that's not how anything works. The truth is that the treasury is thought to have actually been a tomb to a 1st century king, or maybe a 1st century BCE king, built at the height of Petra's power and wealth, and you can see how it would have impressed visitors. But such a grand capital had far more to it than just the facade. This is a typical Nabataean house. Like the rest of Petra, it's carved out of the rock, but it's not as elaborate as the treasury or the monastery. The Nabataeans have records of their existence going back to perhaps the 8th century BCE, although there is no definitive written record of them until the 4th century BCE. The Nabataeans were an Arab people who made an incredible amount of wealth trading spices across the desert. They controlled the Arabian Peninsula in the centuries prior to Islam, connecting Aden to Aqaba, Gaza, and Mesopotamia. But more than spices, they were also the ancient Mediterranean's only source of frankincense, and given the huge use of incense in religious rituals, this was a big deal. The Nabataeans were a nomadic people, meaning they lived on the move, and they were small and likely never numbered more than a few thousand. So although the city of Petra looks pretty impressive, these stone caves were not permanent dwellings, and most of their elaborate architecture didn't come until later in their existence when they were more settled. Petra quickly became the capital and trade center of a long string of settlements. The port of Gaza was their primary destination into Europe, but it's important to note that you don't have to be in Jordan to see Nabataean ruins. You can also see them here in Avdat, Israel. I particularly enjoyed this city, if I'm honest. There's a couple more in Israel, and there's even a second Petra in Hijra, Saudi Arabia, which I haven't had the pleasure of visiting. At least, not yet. A lot of their most impressive monuments, including the treasury and the monastery, weren't built until later in Petra's Nabataean history. Both of these monuments, Petra's largest, were built in the 1st century CE or the very later end of the 1st century BCE. It was at this point where the Nabataeans were still incredibly wealthy and had been taking a lot from Greek and Hellenistic influences. They'd also been becoming more settled. The Nabataeans were one of the few people of the ancient Mediterranean who were never part of the Hellenistic Empire, and there are no records of Alexander the Great ever trying to confront them. However, there are records of his general Antigonus, who was beaten back not once but 3 times. Antigonus's army just couldn't reach them thanks to the rugged terrain, the Nabataean water system, and the isolated location. Yet the Nabataeans did grow increasingly sedentary. As their wealth grew with the businesses of the great empire of the Mediterranean, especially that of Rome, they began to settle, building ever greater monuments and staying there a lot longer. Rome attempted to conquer them once, but made the mistake of, well, telling them it was coming. During Augustus's expansion, the Romans asked the Nabataeans to take them to the source of frankincense and spices, especially along to Yemen and Somalia, and I guess they assumed the Nabataeans, who had guarded this secret for centuries, would accept it being undermined because Rome. Well, the Nabataeans naturally didn't want to fight Rome nor submit to them, so they led the Romans in a circuitous route around the Arabian Peninsula, something that the Romans only realized once they'd lost most of their men and all of their motivation. Believe it or not, the Romans didn't seek retribution. It was just way too expensive to try. Even so, Rome would eventually come for the Nabataeans. Petra was conquered by the Emperor Trajan in 106 CE in a campaign that was barely noted. The Nabataeans went without much of a fight to speak of, and, unlike Trajan's other conquests, this one actually proved permanent. And why did these Nabataeans, who had fought back the armies of Alexander the Great's generals 3 times, suddenly collapse to Rome without much of a fight? Well, there's a lot of debate behind this. Not a lot of it is very certain, but the most likely explanation is because Rome simply expanded too far. Rome already controlled the Red Sea and were directly trading with India, Yemen, and Somalia through Egypt, cutting out almost all of the Nabataean wealth and the need for them to transport things over the desert. Essentially, Nabataean influence and importance had declined. But Petra itself remained. Petra's time in Roman hands lasted just as long, and a new wave of construction followed. How can you tell the difference? It's actually really easy. This is Nabataean, this is Roman, this is Nabataean, and this is Roman. If it's still not obvious, look at the construction. Nabataeans carved things completely out of the rock, while Romans built new freestanding buildings out of brick. This was a common Roman theme, and also, incidentally, how you can tell the difference between a Greek theater converted for Roman uses and a new Roman theater fresh built. But one thing you won't notice here is aqueducts. The Nabataean system of supplying water to the city was already so efficient that the Romans literally could not improve it. And as the Romans converted to Christianity, so too did Petra. The monastery, despite being conceived as a temple to a Nabataean god, for once actually became the thing we call it. Though the treasury was probably never a treasury, the large monastery actually did function as one. It was during this era of Christianization that the huge plain in front of it was leveled out, and it functioned as a pretty good spot for a monastery. It's actually quite a long and beautiful walk from the treasury at the front of the city to the monastery at the back. And again, this was purposeful. These are the 2 largest monuments in Petra, one facing the sea and the other facing the desert. One of the first things you saw entering from the west was a huge crevasse, and the first thing you saw approaching from the mountains of the east was this monastery. It was a nice symmetry. When you do come here, you'll notice that there aren't a lot of Roman buildings left, and what there are lie in the flat plains around the mountains, not actually in the mountains or the passes themselves. Part of this was because the Romans simply couldn't match the Nabataean city, and honestly, even Romans didn't want to try. They, too, appreciated the beauty of this city. But part of it is also because, despite the city's world-renowned fame and status, very little archaeology has actually been done on it. Most of the larger Roman city is still buried in the desert. And the Nabataeans kept their stone carving a secret. No one ever really figured out how they did it. They left very few written records, and even a single mistake would mean the building was ruined. Yet, these structures are seemingly flawless, damaged only by time and later... idiots. However, we believe they were unusually carved from the top to the bottom, which might not have done much to prevent mistakes, but did at least prevent rock slides from coming down and ruining their work. The city itself fell into decline after the Roman conquest anyway, but it still remained a pretty large city and a hub of trade, that is until about 362, when one of the famous late Roman earthquakes hit it. At least this earthquake is famous if you study Roman history. It devastated a lot of cities in the area, not just Petra, also Antioch, Palmyra, Damascus, but Petra itself was particularly harmed because the Nabataean water system, these cisterns, they were damaged and they were irreparable. And because the Nabataeans no longer served a trading function, other Arab tribes had come up to take over the desert trade routes, and at any rate, Rome still controlled the sea routes to India. There just didn't seem to be a need to keep Petra anymore. So it simply lost its purpose. The city continued to be used as a shelter by the nomadic Bedouin, however, it was sparse and became lost to history. And this might be where our story ended. However, the story of its rediscovery is one which is very interesting and, depending on who's telling it, a little problematic. The city was rediscovered by the Swiss traveler Johann Burkhart, a typical European of his time intent on discovering long-lost cities of classical antiquity. Now, to hear Europeans tell it, this is a man who studied the Arab lifestyle, the Arabic language, and joined the Islamic religion. He eventually went through a conversion, spending several years among the Bedouin with his Islamic name until eventually he found Petra on his journey and recounted it to the world. Now, as you can imagine, the Bedouin tell this story a little differently. Now, the Bedouin version of events goes a little bit differently. They don't dispute the beginning of the story, but as he was living among them for a few years, their version of events says that upon his request, they showed him a secret location they only showed to insiders. And this happened to be Petra, and he went around blabbing it to the world, which they obviously didn't like because it revealed it to a lot of non-Muslim European colonials. Now, it can be very popular to believe the Bedouin version of events, but not, I think, entirely accurate. At least no more accurate than to take the European account at face value as well, of this traveling hero who ingratiated himself with the natives and did nothing wrong. While Burkhart probably did betray a bit of Bedouin trust by reporting it back to his colleagues in all Christian colonial Europe, he probably didn't intend this to be an insult. By all other measures, he was genuine, and after discovering Petra, remained very much a part of the Arab world and in Arab culture, even undertaking his own Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, which he was permitted to enter in 1814. He ended up dying in Cairo in 1817, where he was given a Muslim funeral and a tomb that bears his Muslim rather than his Christian name. And today, however the old Bedouin might have felt about it, the modern Bedouin who still live in the city depend on the tourists for their income. All this is to say, it's complicated, and nothing should stop you from visiting it. Especially because one thing we can all agree on is that Petra really is beautiful. You can see why tourists flock here, why this desert is the set of so many movies, and why Jordan is among the most memorable countries I have ever visited. Petra can be quite expensive to get to, isolated, but much like those travelers coming to the city 2,000 years ago, those who make the journey will be richly rewarded. The city leaves a lasting impression, and at the end of the day, that's exactly what it was supposed to do. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. As usual, here's my sources, and please remember to like and subscribe and follow me on my other platforms. Anyway, until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.